People who work in HR, what's the wildest thing you discovered that led to a firing in the course of your career? So, I used to work at a software company and we kept getting complaints about a nap room being cluttered and trash from the nearby break room being left around in the mornings. So, we asked security to do some late evening walk-bys to see what was going on. One evening, they found a young Asian woman hiding in the nap room. She didn't work there and she didn't speak English. It was super weird. It turns out, one of the software engineers who worked in the building had purchased a mail-order bride. But here's the kicker, he was already married. So, unable to bring his new mail-order bride home, he kept her at the office. No idea where she hid during the day, but at night she made good use of our little nap room. Gotta feel bad for that poor woman. Story 2. We had a very nice HR lady who absolutely spoiled one of the employees. In a wholesome way, he was a young immigrant boy who desperately needed a job, about 15 years old. So she'd go out of her way to give him rides, encourage management to give him raises, and even made him homemade meals. She eventually found out he was stealing all of their customers' credit card information and running them all out dry, which is why we had been receiving so many criminal reports regarding our company. Not only this, but he would flat out steal their purses and wallets while they were there. I'm talking hundreds of thousands mysteriously missing from our customers in a matter of a few months. It absolutely broke her heart when she had to fire him and report him to the police. He was immediately arrested for a large number of crimes and deported. The American dream. Story 3. Car dealership. Co-owner of the company had a used car lot he had registered under a friend's name. The big dealership would take in used cars. He'd pay a technician off the books to give it a bad inspection so the car would go to auction. He'd use the other company to purchase the cars for dirt cheap and sell the cars at a huge profit margin. Essentially, got our KBB rep fired because she was evaluating trade-ins as being in good condition, but the inspections would all come back bad. So in the company's eyes, she was terrible at her job and paying people way too much for their trade-ins. They started to catch on when they realized close to 40% of all the trade-ins were getting poor inspections. So they implemented a system where 2 technicians each did their own inspections. Suddenly, not so many cars were getting poor inspections. Then it all unraveled when they looked into it deeper and realized every single bad inspection came from one technician. In total, they estimated roughly $400,000 in profit had been stolen from the company over the past couple years. It was pretty messy. Story 4. Long time ago, I was an IT contractor working for a large company. There was probably about 20 of us on this one team that were all contracted by an IT staffing firm. It came to light that one of my colleagues had been previously fired as a high school teacher for a scam where he would go to his student's place of employment, Target, Best Buy, etc., and steal a bunch of crap in exchange for giving them good grades. When this happened, it was revealed that the IT consulting firm had not run background checks on any of us. The company we were working for called us into an office and said that they needed to do background checks on all of us, and if there was anything to disclose, now was the time. No one said a word. In the next 2 weeks, one guy was let go because he had done time for mail fraud, another guy for assaulting his ex, another guy for getting kicked out of the military for attacking a senior officer, and another guy who was a former police officer, who it turned out was under indictment for allegedly essaying an underage girl in his squad car. That was an interesting month. Dang, a quarter of them had to be let go. Statistically, somebody watching this video, or a few people, are very, very horrible. Nose goes. Story 5. Years ago, I was covering at both HR and LP manager for a district in a now defunct retail chain. The stores carried a variety of adult magazines, also now all defunct. Overstocked for these lucrative and quick-selling products were in a storeroom. There was a very small, for the time, camera in the room. One day, I was reviewing footage at a store and I was idly watching an assistant manager restock after closing. Then something odd happened. He was taking one copy of each adult magazine, opening it to a photo spread, and laying it down on the floor. Soon there was about 15 magazines spread out. He left for a moment and then returned, in view of the cam, completely naked. Then he laid down on the magazines and started rolling around and, well, you can guess what happened next. I met with him the next day and I said, I need to let you know there's a camera in the magazine storage area. He stood up and said, okay then, and walked out of the store. I ended up putting him in our system as resigned and didn't dispute his unemployment claim when he filed. I went ahead and told the next person who took over the restocking job that a camera was there before he even touched a single magazine. I couldn't do that. I mean, for a variety of reasons, but also it's like, I don't know, I'm scared of paper cuts. And you're so vulnerable. Story 6. I heard a story of a guy using an unmarked company car to run Uber Eats and DoorDash all day. He got away with it for a couple years. He finally got caught because he was using his work phone for Uber and his data was astronomically higher than anyone else in the company. If he had just used his personal phone, he probably could still be going. Story 7. I have two. One, a guy kept watching adult content on his work computer, which was partially in view of other people. He was warned to never do it again. He was an excellent employee, but that is a fireable offense. He did it again. They mounted a camera behind his desk and told him they were going to monitor him from now on. He did it again. They had no choice but to fire him. 2. One day somebody looked for something in a new guy's, a couple of months, desk drawer. They found hundreds of little pieces of paper, each with an offense detailing when somebody made him angry. Some of them made it clear the notes were instead of hurting people. Story 8. Previous HR manager was alright, smart, friendly with everyone, good people skills. He was even an adjunct professor during my last year in college. Taught behavior modification and abnormal psychology. Then his wife divorced him for beating her. He went off the proverbial cliff, started calling young, attractive girls from the lab to his office over the intercom, told them he was obsessed with them and offered them all expense-paid trips to nearby music festivals, promised them free drugs, whatever they wanted. They all turned him down. One girl received a decent settlement. He was immediately fired when they found out, of course. He has spent the last few years trolling around our college town, trying to screw anything that would give him the time of day. It's outwardly obvious he is on hard drugs. Multiple stalking, assault, domestic violence charges, banned from 24 local businesses. Absolutely unhireable anywhere serious ever again. Story 9. My friend worked IT support for a hospital. They would have the ability to remote desktop into employees' laptops even without authentication from the user, but was only supposed to be done under special circumstances. He had an urgent ticket which required a remote login, but the doctor was completely unreachable, so he ended up just connecting to the laptop. Turns out the doctor was watching adult content at that very moment, and he immediately logged out, hoping nothing would come of it. Apparently, the doctor reported the situation, landing them both in trouble. Story 10. It came to my attention, after a few times, that a woman would stay in a restroom stall and take all the toilet paper off the rolls by just unraveling it, and she was seen putting what she had rolled up and put it in her locker a few times. She claimed she was too poor for women's hygiene products, so she was told that they are provided, and there was no need for her to use that much toilet paper for that. Hoped that was the end of it. It started again and she claimed this time it was for wounds and she couldn't afford gauze and wound dressings. Okay, so we just told her again she could use what the first aid kits we had. Management wanted to be gentle. So it starts up again and she confessed she just liked stealing things and this was easy. She was termed after that one. It's like she didn't even need it at all. They're like, yeah, just use the first aid kit or just use the toilet paper we have. It's fine. Just use it as needed. She's like, okay, you know what? Honestly, it's the thrill of the chase for me. Story 11. When I worked for a federal government, one of our senior managers was dating two women that were his contractors. They lost the contract to a competitor. Not wanting to lose his harem, he demanded the new company hire them. They said, LOL, no. He canceled their contract in retaliation. They sued and the truth came out. Our CIO demanded he quit. He said he was a disabled vet and she couldn't fire him. He literally told her to go F herself. He ended up just moving. Not fired, not demoted. They just moved him out of IT. He still works there. Story 12. My experience, I have seen a lot of wild stuff, but people in HR were the wildest. HR generalist was pregnant. The father was one of the people on the production floor, but she didn't know which one. Fist fights broke out among all the potential fathers. HR VP was fired after a paid conference he attended was actually just a free vacation for him and his family. And he didn't even go to the same city as the conference. HR director was having an affair with IT director, both married. When they were confronted, they both denied it, so they were both fired. I saw them 7 years later on a plane coming back from Europe. Still together. You need like an HR department for the HR department. Story 13. Had an IT guy in the healthcare company. He already seemed a bit odd, and lots of people made up rumors in the office, which we had to stop. One day, I'm in the subway system waiting for my husband, and I see him. Naturally, I wave hello, and the color from his face drains, and he runs away with haste. I couldn't figure it out, then started to worry about his mental health, so I raised it to my supervisor the next day. When I tell her what happened, color from her face drains, and tells me to sit tight and leave the room. A police officer walks in and asks me to retell what I saw. I was very confused, and as it turns out, the police had come earlier that morning to raid our office and take all his computers and phones. He was charged with CP as he was taking upskirt photos of teenage girls at the very subway station I saw him at. It was all over the news, and I was in shock for a good week. Got a lot of, "I told you he was a perv," from the folks he made feel uneasy. Story 14. Fired a guy for selling poor quality adult content DVDs. Long story short, someone bought an adult content DVD on eBay and was dissatisfied with the quality, so called the number listed as the contact info for the seller. He called and demanded to speak to the president of the company. He was transferred to the president of the company and let the president know how upset he was about the quality of his adult content. It was a manufacturing company. The guy had listed the company address and main phone number as his seller contact info. You know, I don't consume that kind of content, but I didn't realize there were standards for it. I just kind of assumed it was all created equal, but it's funny to imagine a hub critic. Story 15. I did some repair work in a food production facility. One of the employees there told me a funny story about a guy that got fired. This guy would come in every day, clock in, do a little work, then disappear. It took a while for anyone to realize he was not working at this is a big facility, but no one could figure out where he was going. He wasn't leaving the building either. This apparently was a mystery for a while. Finally, it was discovered he had somehow got his hands on a copy of the elevator service key, and he was running the elevator up partway, stopping it, opening the doors, and climbing into the space below the elevator car. Elevators have a crawl space below them for maintenance. He apparently slept down there and then came out before the end of his shift, did a little work like nothing was wrong, then went home. The ultimate hide-and-seek player. Story 16. He didn't get fired, but in the days of MSN Messenger and Outlook pop-ups on Windows XP, a pop-up showed up as a co-op student was chatting to a friend on his work desktop, so the message was intended for a friend. What happened was that an email came in with a quick reply which captured his message and sent it to the company. I'll summarize the email. Email to the company. The lunch lady is sick and won't be here today. Co-op student's response. Sorry it slipped out. Just like my wiener out of your mom's loose body. He was petrified when he realized and went into the boss's office. They sent him home for the day and he sent an apology email the next day. Story 17. My mom works at a local hospital in HR and she told me this doozy a while back. They had an employee that worked in the maintenance department and also happened to be dating a nurse from that hospital. The employee and the nurse broke things off, and the guy had nowhere to live and access to the whole hospital and offsite buildings. He continued to do his job but was living there during his off time. People would report a laptop and blanket and pillow and sleeping setup where there shouldn't be someone sleeping. It was in supply closets or unused offices. Nothing was ever said to him about it, but they had to fire him when the local police had to arrest him during his shift in front of everyone because the ex-girlfriend accused him of stealing her stuff. Weeks later, when he came back asking for his stuff, is when they knew for certain it was him living on the property. My mom said he was a nice guy, but it was a really awkward situation. Story 18. Well-known public company here in the U.S. The chief legal officer was caught banging the executive assistant of the high-powered CEO in the work parking lot at lunch by the security team that patrols the parking lot. Both had to come in and get their items out of their desks and were fired on the spot. She looked absolutely drained, and I heard on the way out she had no regrets, as his wiener was the most amazing she had ever had. They both were married at the time. Story 19. Not in HR myself, but I did work closely with the woman who headed up the department. My immediate supervisor was a guy with decades of experience. You would be hard-pressed to find a guy with more experience in the industry, and he was incredibly knowledgeable. He was a self-taught tech guy who pretty much knew his way around anything and everything related to computers and programming. A whiz kid who had been there since the earliest days of the company and had worked his way up to being the boss's right-hand man. They had a falling out, and the boss was hell-bent on getting rid of the guy, but he knew he needed a dang good excuse as everybody knew that he had been integral in growing the organization, and without him, it would never become anywhere near as successful. The customers loved him. All of us looked up to him. He was just one of those rare guys. Smart, good-looking, talented, likable, but he didn't let any of it get to his head. He was a really down-to-earth, cool guy. Anyway, the boss keeps digging and eventually strikes gold. The guy had lied on his original job application. He had said he was 18 when he was actually only 17. Everybody knew that the boss had pressured him into doing that because it was illegal for a minor to work in that industry at the time due to issues with insurance. Anyway, he terminated him, and it stuck as there was a clause in the contract stating that lying on any company form is a fireable offense, and there was no statute of limitations on that. The guy had been with the company for something like 30 years and had seen it grow from a small business operation above a tobacconist to one of the leading firms in the industry. And because it was for just cause, he didn't receive a dime. I left a few years later, and the company finally folded for a good couple of years after that. Last I heard, the guy who was let go was working for his brother putting up fencing. I don't know what the falling out was, but never underestimate how petty someone will be to get rid of you. The guy had been there for 30 years. I mean, there was no squashable beef. You had to go and just destroy his whole career? Come on. Story 20. I have a few. 1. Person decided it would be a good idea to fill their water bottle with vodka and get crap-faced at work. So much so that they fell down the stairs, passed out, crapped themselves, and then got belligerent with the cops. Put her on unpaid leave and LCA to go to rehab, but she didn't believe she had a problem. She failed to complete rehab and got fired. 2. Paramedic punched a restrained patient in the face. Hard. 3. Had an AC mechanic embezzle about $20,000 on the company CC, buying AC units for friends, his kids' hockey fees, etc. Didn't think it was a big deal. 4. Had a tech steal a customer's purse while doing an install. Found out because her ID card was located. And we got the camera footage from the gas station he stopped at to refuel the company vehicle, and also his girlfriend's on the company dime. He denied it even though it was very clearly on camera. Story 21. Not in HR, but a colleague/friend discovered that her boss, running an admin team organizing travel among other things, had used company money to book flights and a rental car for her and her kids to go on a weekend trip. The boss had gotten a more junior member of staff to change some things in the system that covered it up, without them realizing. It was only when my friend had to do a deep dive in the system for some other stuff that she noticed the discrepancies leading to discovering the sneaky theft. From my point of view, this woman was in the office in the morning, and then all of a sudden she was gone. Nothing was ever said officially to explain why she disappeared, but my friend told me they gave her the choice of resigning immediately or criminal charges. Criminal charges would have been a very bad look for the organization, so I can see why they wanted to keep it quiet. Story 22. I do not work in HR, but this one was a doozy, watching from the sidelines to say the least. This was right after the COVID and after our out-of-state corporate overlords had fired the entire division's accounting team and HR manager. They now realized a year later, as people were returning to the office, they needed to hire a new HR manager. Them, being the omniscient beings they were, decided to not let our local branch decide who to hire, but instead they blessed us 5 states away with this whirlwind of a story. In comes Nicholas W., a short, heavy-set man that had eerily charismatic slime to him. Just what you'd expect for HR manager material. Well, roughly a month or so after starting one Monday, he does not show up to work, and new hires were waiting for their orientation. Not responding to calls, texts, or emails from the office, someone else stepped in to process their orientation. The next day, same thing. On the 3rd day, his sister gets in contact with corporate and says that he had an emergency with his father in Florida and he was unavailable, but would be back to work and reach out the next week. Well, this raised a few questions, figuring as IT had tracked his phone and it was showing that his company phone was in LA. Well, our heads of IT did some further digging of his own and realized that our dear leaders at corporate headquarters did not appear to do a background check on this man. Apparently, he was a con man who had lied on his resume about working for fictitious businesses and at one point ran for Congress. Well, the whole office was abuzz when the next week it was revealed that he had not in fact been in Florida, surprise, surprise, but in fact in LA. arrested and in custody for human trafficking and exploitation of a minor. What really just puts the icing on the cake is that this is the same man who had over a month's access to hundreds of employees' banking info, social security numbers, and ID cards. So yeah, a little bit different tale of crazy HR stories. Story 23. Dude requested a letter from HR to provide his insurance company to state that he was on shift on a particular day at a particular time, and therefore could not have been the one driving when his car was involved in an accident. For similar letters in the past, we provide 1. Their roster for the day, 2. Confirmation of their clock in and out times, 3. Their scan in and out times of their security ID to show someone was rostered on, clocked in, and didn't leave the building before clocking out. Turns out this guy hadn't actually worked that day, and when he realized he would actually check before putting it in writing, tried to use his supervisor level access to alter historical records to say that he was on shift. He got caught out because the system wouldn't let you alter your own roster. When the inevitable, "No, we will not help you commit insurance fraud, turn in your ID," conversations happened and all facts presented to him, it was the only time I've heard a union rep say words to the effect of entirely siding with HR in a dismissal. Story 24. We had 2 temps who knew each other from outside of work, both starting on the same day, but in different departments, and both referred by the same recruitment agency. My lunchtime, their managers were concerned that they didn't actually appear to be getting any actual work done despite appearing to be quite busy. So we asked IT to have a look at their email logs. They had spent the entire morning just chatting to each other over email. The logs were like, 9:05. What's your boss like? 9:05. Bit of a knob. Yours? 9:05. Same. What are you doing tonight? 9:06. Not sure. You? And so on. They had literally spent 8 hours between the 2 of them just chatting nonstop. Not surprising that they hadn't done any actual work. We kicked them both out and rang the recruitment agency to let them know. As a result, not only were they not paid for their half day, but the recruitment agency kicked them off their books and also told every other recruiter in the city to avoid these 2 idiots like the plague. Story 25. I didn't work in HR, but I worked as the outsourced IT lead for a company. I matrix managed the incumbent IT staff too. The incumbent staff had been there pretty much for their entire careers and were coasting in for a nice retirement. They felt I was there to take their jobs, and they took some time to win them around. I just about managed to get their trust when, one morning, the IT director approaches me and says, "This has been found on a printer. Can we establish whom?" The printout was a rather distasteful adult content. I was about to secrete myself in a locked office and not tell any of the team what I was doing. Proxy logs downloaded. For non-IT people, this is a list of which computer accessed the internet, which site, and what time. I filtered the logs and removed all genuine business stuff, then all casual browsing. I was left with quite a list of interesting sites. Whilst doing this, my team and the incumbent team were pressing me hard as to my secret mission. I then downloaded DHCP and Active Directory logs. Again, for non-techies, the first shows what computer name was issued which network address at a specific point in time. The second shows which member of staff logged onto the network, what time, and which PC. I was then able to correlate who logged onto which specific PC at which time and also the internet sites they used with absolute certainty. Armed with my report, I was summoned to a meeting with the HR director, IT director, and managing director. Transpires that the printout was quickly identified as a certain user and they had their wrist slapped. However, there was one other person casually browsing adult content outside of the standard office hours. Not only that, but it was CP, which needed reporting to the police. You guessed it, one of my extended team looking forward to retirement. Oh, I've got another when I was a mere apprentice. An admin lady was escorted from the office. Turns out that her deep desk drawer with built-in filing rails was also perfect at hiding about 6-liter bottles of vodka, all empty. Well, there are some bad IT people, but clearly this guy, in his reverse engineering or whatever that tech jargon was, that he was able to find out who did that is very impressive, and watch your back, evildoers. We got good nerds on the case. Story 26. I spent 6 years working in automotive at a luxury European dealership. Salesmen are gross, sexual predators, and love drugs and alcohol. Our top salesman at the time had worked there for almost 10 years. Always got in trouble with HR for either harassing a female coworker or showing up to work with some drug crumbs on his suit. He finally got fired after Snapchatting himself driving 120 kilometers per hour in a customer's new car due to be delivered the next day. What an effing idiot. You hate to see the old self-report. But, he had it coming. Story 27. Not HR, obligatory, but felt this one qualified. Some discrepancies were noted on a corporate credit card. However, it wasn't 100% sure if it was for legit purposes, and they were in the middle of an acquisition, so an investigation didn't immediately begin. Until a huge charge landed on the card. Something like $5,000. Turns out a random employee had purchased a trip for themselves and their family to some resort banana country. What's better, said employee had already left the country on vacation. They canceled the return trip. Story 28. So I worked for a company that assembled medical devices and couldn't be asked to do a proper background check. We had 2 instances of sexual predators working for us. First instance was this massive guy who was very kind, but he was odd. No one knew what to make of him, but were happy that he was content doing the most mindless and menial tasks. One day, guy doesn't show up for work and we can't reach him. The state 2 days later called us and explained that he was a registered sex offender, and the nature of the materials he had and was sharing meant that he basically had a social worker checking in on him and that he could not be on an unregistered electronic device with access to the internet. We had to use computers and the internet for our jobs. IT basically had to shut down our intranet and let the state do a sweep to make sure he didn't do anything untoward with our systems. But yeah, guy never notified anyone he was taking or subsequently working a job, and he managed to keep that up for an effing year. Then like 3 months later, they hire another oddball who worked for 2 weeks and finally came clean that he lied on his application and that he was a sex offender. All I know was he was marched out of the production area and shown the door when his record finally was uncovered. 2 sexual predators like that back to back makes me question the interview process. Story 29. 1. Worker kept pooping in a trash can. First offense was a slap on the wrist. It could have been a badly timed or unexpected bowel movement. Second offense was let go. 2. Guy called himself Shadow Wolf and liked to sneak up on women and just stand there. Nope, let go. 3. Soldier took lots of drugs while in charge of a large vessel, albeit docked for the night. Initiated proceedings to separate but was stopped by his father, a high-ranking officer. 4. Lots of people sleeping in different places, behind false walls, inside of a trailer, up in elevated forklifts, inside lockers, etc. 5. Woman actively cheating on her husband in an office setting with a coworker. Didn't try to hide it. Other women began to talk about her, so she logged into one of their computers and sent out nasty grams posing as them. Fired. Story 30. Not in HR, but my dad used to own a gay bar, and some wild stuff happened there due to the vast majority of the staff being involved in a drug ring. After buying the gay bar, my dad put in security cameras to try and cut down on the drug dealing going on the premises because he didn't like dealing with the cops. He held a big meeting with all the staff and let them know that there were now cameras installed and anyone caught dealing drugs on the bar property would be fired on the spot. Literally the exact same night the dishwasher sold fake drugs to somebody right in front of the cameras right before closing. The guy he sold the fake drugs to ended up coming back with a hammer to kill the dishwasher. But since the bar was closed, he settled for breaking in and smashing up a toilet in the bathroom instead. The next day, when my dad reviewed the tapes in order to find out what had happened, he of course saw the dishwasher selling the fake drugs directly in front of the camera. Guy couldn't have been more obvious about selling drugs if he tried. When my dad fired the dishwasher, he asked him why he had sold the fake drugs right in front of the camera. The dishwasher said he didn't think anyone would actually check the camera. Anyways, my dad actually still has the hammer the disgruntled customer used to smash up the toilet in the evidence bag that the police gave to him, and somewhere in our basement. Story 31. I'm third-party HR for a ton of companies. My favorite story was the CEO giving his employee birthday spankings. Just the female employees, though. It apparently went on for a long time before someone spoke up. He was terminated, obviously. Story 32. I knew a guy who worked in a call center who, instead of using one of his two 15-minute breaks to use the restroom, would pee directly into a potted plant while live on a call with a caller. He only got caught when during the day the smell of piss would loft around the office. Another guy who worked 8 years at the company already took a cup from the community kitchen home and was canned for stealing company property. Turns out it was his own cup and he was offered his job back, but he turned it down. I have to imagine that plant was not exactly thriving by the time they found it. Story 33. This is a fun one. Too bad the thread is old enough it probably won't be seen. Anyway, I worked for this charity that raised money for health-related causes. This local hospital wanted an exoskeleton for people who are paralyzed and going through physiotherapy. These things are very cool. You strap a person in, and when they start working the controls, they can walk around on their own, even go up and down stairs. They are also exceedingly expensive, and the one they wanted cost about $300,000. One of the staff is working with a donor who gives $100,000 towards it. Another staff person says, "Hey, I have a donor I'm meeting with in a few weeks that might put up the rest." So far, so good. About 2 months later, these enormous, extremely heavy boxes show up in our office, addressed to the woman who got the first $100K. Turns out there's an exoskeleton in them. Now, we're not actually at a hospital, we're in an office building, and we sure as F do not receive the medical equipment we fund. We send the money to the hospital administration, and they buy it. So everyone was very confused. The woman's boss, seeing her name on the shipping label, goes to ask her what this is all about, who immediately turns to the other staff members who'd said she might have another donor, and asks if she got the other $200K for the exoskeleton. The response? No, they were out of town, so I haven't met with them yet. The first staff person then screeches, throws an effing stapler at the second staff person's head, misses, thank goodness, and then storms out of the office, and everyone watches out the window as she heads to her car and drives away. Eventually, we pieced together what happened. The staff person had told the hospital we could probably fund their exoskeleton, and they told her, "Great, but we need to order it right away because the price is going up soon." So despite not having the other $200,000 nor possessing any authority to do so whatsoever, she called up the company who made it and ordered one. Even more baffling, the company sent it to her despite our charity having no account with them, no credit with them, no history, nothing. They just shipped the effing thing to her as though all this was totally normal, along with an invoice for $300,000. We never did figure out how she pulled that off. We also quickly realized that all of this adds up to us owing $300K for an exoskeleton where we only have a third of the money. Anyways, she doesn't come back to work for 3 days. Doesn't answer her phone or text, doesn't respond to emails, nothing. Then on the 4th day, she shows back up as though nothing had happened and all was totally normal. Sat down at her desk and started working as though it were a regular old day. Doesn't say a word to anyone until her boss discovered her there, at which point she was immediately fired. It was a pain in the butt getting the exoskeleton to the hospital too, and there were all sorts of problems with the warranty and taking it into their inventory because they were not set up to receive actual medical equipment from us, just money. And we were the legal owners of the thing, not the hospital. But eventually we all worked that out. Oh yeah, and also, fortunately, the second staff person finally got around to meeting with her donor, who indeed decided to pay the rest of the balance owing off. It was the most bizarre set of circumstances at work I have ever encountered. Story 34. Not HR, but I had to send the email to HR. Steel foundry, blue collar, all male environment. I was a lead at the time eating lunch with my guys in the break room. 2 of the guys were talking crap and one of them told the other that he had a small wiener. He didn't like that and really wanted to make sure everyone knew how big his wiener really was. He literally whipped it out right there on the clock in front of 12 dudes. Obviously, I have to tell my foreman. He talks to his boss and they ask me to send an email detailing the event. Most awkward thing to write in my life, and he obviously was fired. Story 35. Dad was a hospital administrator. ER surgery doc comes in and says Dad needs to fire Nurse Hottie. Dad says Nurse Hottie just had performance reviews scored top-notch this report and every report. So why the firing? Doc says that he has been dreaming of Nurse Hottie and really wants to bang her. Never made a move, but decided his unclean thoughts needed to be shared with his wife. Wife goes ape crap, can't blame her, wants Nurse Hottie fired. Now this is and was a rural hospital. To replace a top ER surgeon is not an overnight solution. Doc hasn't done anything, neither has the nurse. Dad can't lose either. End result, Nurse Hottie got a wonderful promotion and transferred to the department of her choice. Doc Dipcrap was eventually replaced. Story 36. Not in HR, but a guy who worked in the department next to mine watched so much adult content on his work laptop that he called IT because his computer was too slow. They found all the open tabs and fired him. One of the only days I was ever sick, we had someone from another department at our team meeting. As it was ending, the a-hole on my team outed the guy as gay and asked our boss if he was gay also, because they discussed liking the same bar. They took his laptop, phone, and escorted him off the property. Real a-hole boomer. No loss there. Story 37. This one is pretty effed up. Child unaliver. Not HR, but a trainer for a large call center. One lady I trained was one of the friendliest and sweetest people in the office. Big, bright, infectious smile. I was genuinely happy to see her each day just because she would brighten the place up. After training, she was out on the floor taking calls for about 2 to 3 months. One day she comes in smiling just as usual. I would not have told you one thing was off. About 12 o'clock, 4 police officers came walking in. They had a solemn, commanding presence. HR pointed to her desk. They walked over, said very little, put her in handcuffs, and walked her out with zero commotion. Turns out she had unalived her infant son that morning and then came to work that day like nothing happened. After finding out what she did, I have a hard time looking at people the same way. You would have never guessed that this woman even distantly capable of such evil. The devil wears sheep's clothing, after all. Story 38. I no longer work in HR, but still work for the same company. We are a very large HIV care provider, and being one of the few men in HR, I was the person who made sure staff made it to their cars without any incident upon termination. We had a tech who I was told we were letting go because his ex-girlfriend called and made us aware that he had a private conspiracy-based YouTube channel. It was very V for Vendetta style. One of those videos was about how HIV was fake and all a government-made thing. We let the guy go, and I walked him to the car, and he never even asked one question. This was over 10 years ago, and I still wonder if he knew. For all I knew, before this, he was great at his job and provided great care to our clients. Story 39. I don't work in HR, but we're a pretty small company. One year at the company Christmas party, which was at a hotel, my former manager got drunk. Then the brother of one of our mechanics also got drunk. My manager, a woman, then decided to wander into the back lobby of the hotel with the mechanic's brother. They both had some relations. They were then caught in the act by a security guard, who my manager then proceeded to assault. My company is now banned from the hotel. Story 40. I'm not HR, but we had a man and woman who were both married to other people fired for having relations at work on the clock. And then the wife of the married man supposedly came into HR and asked, "Why is my husband fired when this second woman he has been sleeping with at work is still here?" People have read it. This woman brought proof her husband was cheating on her with a second woman to our HR, getting the second woman fired also. She is still married to her cheating husband for the kids. Where do people find the time and energy to do this sort of stuff? Story 41. We eliminated the position of one of our longtime employees. She was a real pain in the butt and filed HR complaints all the time for perfume smells and people walking around in sandals that make flopping sounds, radios too loud, etc. All pretty bullcrap complaints. They really weren't terminable offenses, but we just needed to get rid of her. And part of the deal was she got a 40-week severance package. The terminated employee's manager was relatively new. So right after she was terminated, his VP told him to contact IT security and get access to her emails, private directories, instant messages, IMs. Later that day, the manager pulls me aside and tells me they just fired a longtime female privacy administrator right after lunch. Apparently, when he got access to his terminated employees' IMs, they were vile and disgusting exchanges between his ex-employee and the privacy administrator, who were close friends. They had offensive and racist nicknames for him and other managers and VPs in the company, and all of it was there to see on a company asset. The VP was furious. She didn't think to pull those IMs before terminating the employee and giving her a $56,000 severance because she could have been fired for cause and saved the company a lot of money. I mean, this is all horrible. This lady was clearly a douche, but $56,000 severance, hot dog. How do I get one of those? Story 42. A developer in our team delivered his work and replied to emails at odd hours instead of typical 9 to 5. Few days it was okay, but when it happens every single day, we were a bit alert. We worked remotely, and interview was also done remotely. My manager and I decided to call everyone to office for a week. This guy came in like everyone else but didn't speak up during meetings. Always said I'll look into it and respond over email. Now we felt we were onto something. The third day, he said that we confronted him to join the discussion then and there instead of replying later on email. He got scared and broke and confessed that he was not the one working on those projects, and even somebody else interviewed for him, and he was just lip-syncing. He was fired on the spot, and we added an in-person interview as the last step before every hire. Story 43. Not in HR, but I was working for a kitchen remodeling company. In the middle of a kitchen remodel for a minister, when my coworker goes on a wild rant about our boss and then proceeds to make a baseless claim that our boss was trying to get him fired because he was bisexual. I could do nothing but stand there and witness the entire conversation. I was in shock. The customer later told my boss about it and he was fired less than an hour later. The funny part about it was none of us, not even my boss, knew he was bisexual until he started running his mouth that day. Talk about coming out of the kitchen cabinet. But for real, you gotta be careful bottling stuff up because you let it go in the worst way. You guys all hate me for my secrets. Well, what secrets? Oh, don't act like you don't know. Story 44. I'm not in HR, but this one really blew my mind. A former CEO of Best Buy, Brian Dunn, terrible CEO, was married to the founder of Best Buy's, Richard Schultz, daughter. Mr. Schultz was the chairman of the board, which meant he had a duty to protect their stockholders. He found out that Mr. Dunn was cheating on his with a Best Buy employee. I heard it was a secretary. He didn't share that with the board. Well, the board found out, and when they did, they fired Mr. Dunn and Schultz. Yeah, that's crazy. A few months later, I walked into a Best Buy I covered. Several of my best and favorite employees there were gone. I was shocked and went around asking. Turns out a line-level worker there had been having relations with multiple managers and supervisors there. Unfortunately, that led to at least 3 people getting fired. Story 45. Not in HR, but I was told this story by an HR person almost 20 years ago, and this seems relevant. I was at new employee orientation with about a dozen others at a government facility that had its own campus, guard gates, and signs as you come in telling you what wasn't allowed on site. Guns, drugs, that kind of stuff. Lady from HR was with us helping us fill out all the different forms. Then she told us this story that apparently she was involved with. One of the employees had been in a car wreck off-site. No injuries, but his car was being fixed, so the insurance company had authorized him a rental for a week or 2. First day on site with the rental car, and he gets a call from the rental car agency. Sorry to bother you, but we just got a call from the previous person who rented that car, and they believe they left something in the trunk. Would you please check? Oh, by the way, that something was a shotgun in a case. Guy goes to the parking lot, and sure enough, there's a shotgun case in the trunk. He goes to find his supervisor and tells him what has happened, asks what he should do, and Guy gets fired for bringing a gun on site. And there she ended the story. I get zero tolerance about guns, but come on. This guy obviously had no intent. As a new employee, what exactly was my takeaway from that story supposed to be? Management doesn't make reasonable decisions. What your manager doesn't know won't hurt you. Honesty certainly isn't the best policy. Always thoroughly search your rental cars. I don't know what I was supposed to get out of it. I still to this day can't figure out what her purpose was in telling us that story. Story 46. I was a call center manager who had some employees who worked in remote offices. I was driving to one of those offices to fire one of my employees who had falsified hundreds of call records while sitting at her desk doing absolutely nothing. When I got there, the office manager pulled me aside and told me that said employee had gotten into a verbal altercation with one of the customers that came into the office in the middle of the space with everyone watching because that customer's daughter had broken up with that employee's son and there were allegations of cheating afoot. If she hadn't been getting fired for the fraud, that would have been enough. She had other write-ups. The office manager then proceeds to tell me that after that verbal altercation, the employee left the office, sat out in her car waiting for the customer to leave, saw the customer walk out, got out of her car, grabbed the customer's by the arm and shoved her back up against the brick wall of the office, telling her if she ever spoke to her son again, she'd unalive her. And this all happened literally 24 hours earlier. The office manager just found out about it 10 minutes before I walked in from taking a call from said customer who said they were looking at pressing charges and wanted to know if the security cameras caught anything. To my knowledge, she didn't press charges, by the way. No idea how that situation was resolved. 2 years later, that employee messaged me on Facebook when she saw I was advertising a job opening and asked if the company had marked her down as available to rehire. I told her I would love to have cojones as big as hers to even think about asking such a gosh dang ridiculous question, and I blocked her. Story 47. This associate filed grievances upon grievances against this new young guy. She accused him of unwanted advances, workplace gossip, etc., etc. Guy went through the ringer. Her stories didn't add up at all, with all the proof in the world that he couldn't possibly have been a part or involved in any way. Her boyfriend, another employee, just didn't like the guy and coerced her into making false claims to get him fired out of jealousy. The couple were unceremoniously released, and the young dude got a free dinner. On us. For all the bullcrap and bullying he had to put up with for no goddamn reason. He was a good guy. Story 48. The team recorded a virtual client call for those unable to attend. Manager skimmed through it afterward to make sure the whole thing had been recorded. After everyone left at the end of the meeting, one guy, who I assume thought he had also left, picked up a bowl within arm's reach and smoked it before leaving the meeting. The worst part is, it was a very chill company. They didn't care if you smoked, but had the manager not caught that, it would have gone to the client. Story 49. Worked in IT for a little bit and we hired a new guy. Kinda skeevy. Would boast that his girlfriend was a Playboy model. Talked about hacking the FBI. Just bragging all the time. About 2 weeks after he was hired, our servers kept going down. Work was full stop for about a week and a half before he was honeypotted. He had been grabbing the IP address and using low-orbit ion cannon to DDoS the company server in order to slack off. We lost a number of clients because work couldn't be completed and the guy was escorted off the property by police. Don't know what happened to him after. Again, I don't know what any of that means, but if he was able to do all that impressive work, maybe he did hack the FBI. And maybe his girlfriend is a Playboy model. Gosh dang. Story 50. We had two employees who sat next to each other. Let's call them A and B. One day, A realizes her credit card was missing and had a ton of fraudulent charges on it, and was venting to B. B mentions that she thinks it was employee C, and lists all of the reasons why. Somehow, B convinced A that C was to blame. A filed a police report and mentioned that she thought C was at fault. C was questioned, but nothing was found. Weeks later, the police show up at our office and arrested the real credit card thief, B. Apparently, B had done it to others, and in their investigation had B on video using A's card. This is giving some sort of who's on first. Story 51. Had an employee, Bob. Great outgoing personality, good worker. Bob claimed to injure his knee at work. Not manual labor, it's a desk job. Bob was assigned to sit in a chair and monitor a computer terminal. That's all. Bob went to the doctor a few times complaining that he's in so much pain he can't work. I spoke with the doctor on the phone. He told me, I think he has some psychological issues. I can't find anything wrong with his knee. Put a private investigator on Bob. PI walks up to Bob with his camera out in the open, recording him at a big box store loading numerous heavy bags of topsoil into his truck. This is when cameras were big. This is the 90s before iPhones. Bob tells PI he has a landscaping business. PI follows Bob to a job site, records Bob doing heavy landscape work. Yada yada yada, Bob ends up being charged by the state for insurance fraud. But it's not over. I find out Bob was coming in for his weekend shifts, clocking in, leaving, coming back at the end of his shift to clock out. So I fire Bob. Bob files for unemployment. I deny it. Bob files for a hearing. I go to the hearing. Bob brings his wife to the hearing. After being told by the hearing officer that his claim is denied, Bob and his wife lose it and start yelling at the officer. "We've been railroaded! We'll get the money! I guarantee you that!" I get the full investigative background report on Bob. Bob was in Vietnam, had major head injuries from combat, had a history of claims for workers' comp, car accident insurance, scams, slips and falls, etc. Oh man, it was kind of like lighthearted and silly, and that's sad. Story 52. I was the guy's supervisor rather than HR. Dude just didn't come back from lunch one day and didn't answer his phone when we called to check on him. It was out of character for him. He never missed a day and never left early. Plus, he'd given another guy a ride and had dropped him off at the door and said he'd be right in. It was concerning, but I chalked it up to maybe there being some kind of family emergency. Until someone from HR IM'd me to ask if he was in office at the moment. And when I said no, I was asked to please bring him to HR for a meeting if he came in the next day. The next day, he came in as normal and had nothing more to say than something personal came up. I walked him over to HR for the meeting where he was promptly fired and then walked into a meeting room to chat with the cops. Turned out he had hit a car in the parking lot and drove off. Said car belonged to one of the executives. Never really found out much beyond that, but the general suspicion is that he was under the influence, and that's why he ran. Story 53. I worked at a call center for my first job. Big office with 50 agents working in shifts, so there were always at least 10 to 12 people there. One coworker was extremely odd. Crazy cat lady vibes. Very opinionated. One day she showed up to her shift with a huge bag and started to pile on hay onto her work desk. Then the hay started rustling. She had brought her pet rabbit to work and it was sitting there right on her desk, munching away. Suffice to say, security was called and she was escorted off the premises. Not before arguing loudly about what the problem was with her bringing a pet. Story 54. There was this guy in logistics. Nice guy, a little rough around the edges. Known him since I started the job. I had just left an HR role for a new role. Many years later, we find out that he harassed quite a few of the contractors and third-party people. They worked for either the logistics company or warehouse company we used. Apparently, it went on for years. Kinda hard to believe given his usual disposition as a dad joke but frowns upon green jokes kinda guy. This was right under the nose of his wife who worked in the factory. If anyone, we might have thought it was his overly fond of lewd jokes teammate, but it was that guy who apparently is a complete gentleman who helped the last two victim reports upwards and protected them. He also helped uncover the rest of the crap the other guy did. Story 55. Not HR, but our company is in the middle of an investigation and has so far fired 4 employees after it was discovered that they were abusing the Grubhub dinner stipend. So the company I work for provides free breakfast and lunch to all employees. We have our own cafe. For those working overtime or past 6 p.m., they get a daily $25 stipend to order from Grubhub. Well, a small group of employees figured out that old employees' email addresses still worked on it and started pooling together $25 credits into hundreds. It took them 2 years to catch on. Some of these people racked up enough for a down payment on a house, and they want their money back. Story 56. Not HR, but in the mid-90s I worked at a company and the head of an IT department was fired rather abruptly. It turned out he, a married man with a teen daughter, had been courting an underage girl in another state. He was a weirdo. She had mailed him some sexy pics, but his online name on the envelope, so it went to the owner rather than him. When the owner opened it, it was investigated and he was found out and fired. Well, they hired his replacement. 4 months later, he was fired. He was watching a lot of adult content and apparently ignored at least one warning. Rumors was that he was watching bestiality adult content. Well, that was weird, so it was chatter amongst us underlings. And wouldn't you know it, the guy before the weirdo I mentioned first was fired for making calls to a phone sex line from the fax machine after hours. The owner and the senior leaders were all weirdos. After I left, I learned several of them had extramarital affairs with each other. Story 57. Not HR, but years ago at a major NYC ad agency, they had a young handyman. Didn't do much but fix things around the office, and wasn't particularly good at it either. He'd build shelves and they would crash down a week later. One day we came back to the office to find the safe was stolen. Not just a little safe, this has a weight of a ton or more. Plus it was bolted to the floor. The floor was torn up and the area in accounting became an attraction. And the handyman? He and a friend were arrested a few days later when they attempted to buy a Jeep with Amex traveler's checks, printed with the company's name. Not the brightest bulb in the chandelier. Story 58. Working for the city, they purchased a huge garage and gave us free parking badges. Now you had the option of taking the badge, which was free parking anytime, and believe me, downtown at $20 a day, it adds up. So it was smart money to take the badge. Or you can take the stipend of $150 a month and park wherever you want it. Now this genius who had been trying to get into the city for years gets hired as a temp. Claws his way to employee, then management. He gets caught double dipping. Took the stipend, then parks in the garage. And getting validated, which is only reserved for guests. Fired. Story 59. I worked in the federal department and there was a lady who worked as a foreign service officer and managed a particular kind of import permit. Had the job for years. One day the government decides that import permits for this particular item are no longer needed. Almost at the same time her boss retires and a new manager shows up. She explains that she managed those import permits. Boss is new and is not really familiar with the processes and says, "Okay, keep doing that." 3 years later, her group is reorganized and her boss asks about the permits. Boss realizes that she'd done nothing for 3 years and assigns her a new set of permits to manage. She refuses. "I am 2 years from retirement. I'm going to keep doing what I am doing or I will tell HR and the senior directors that you've let me sit here for 3 years doing nothing." She sat there for 2 more years and did nothing. Ooh, finessed by a sweet innocent old lady. And they never saw it coming. Story 60. Not HR, but I used to have a friend who was a stereotypical burnout. He dropped out of high school and was working retail jobs, but his dad was a union longshoreman and pulled some strings. Got him a job with the union with great pay, considering no high school degree, and benefits. My buddy was so excited, and within the first month, he'd gotten a huge tattoo of an anchor on his arm and had financed a Dodge Charger. About 2 weeks later, he went to work crap-housed drunk. His boss tried to send him home, but they got into an argument and my buddy punched him in the face. Fired on the spot. Story 61. Not HR, but years ago I worked at an organization that provided services for vulnerable populations. We had 2 new hires that start around the same time, both in lower paid positions. One was a young woman who didn't show up or call in one day. Later that day, there was a news story about how she and several others were arrested because they were running a trafficking ring. This was a huge problem due to the nature of our work and our clientele, so our manager had to look into her work. Luckily, she had kept her activities outside of work, but it was an unsettling couple of days. The other was a really nice guy, great at his job and personable. He would go above and beyond and even work on projects during his breaks and at home. He begged me for money for bus fare one day because he was short on cash. I gave him some cash and he promised to pay me back. Another coworker pulled me aside and said that he had asked her for money, which she gave him, and he never paid back. I only gave him like $8, so I wasn't too concerned. Turned out he was asking pretty much everyone for money. Then a friend had about $50 stolen from her purse. Because of our clientele, she assumed it was one of them and warned everyone not to bring cash to work. Still, no one suspected him. He lurked around my desk offering to help me, not unheard of for his role. And in hindsight, it was because he knew my part of my role was purchasing large amounts of items, and I'd often have to leave work to shop. Luckily, I had a corporate credit card and did not make purchases in cash. The guy abruptly quit one day, saying that he wasn't making enough and his commute was too far. The next day, it was discovered that petty cash around $300 was missing. There was a camera in the office, and sure enough, this guy had pocketed it. I don't think the organization pursued anything, and it made me sad that he was struggling, but that cash was fundraised to help fund lunches for children. Story 62. I have one. Back in 2001 or so, there was an engineering VP in his 50s that was married and having an affair with a designer who was in her mid-20s. She had some money issues, and according to him, he had loaned her like $20K. There were no written loan documents. In the meantime, their relationship starts to sour. He wants his money back, but she doesn't have it all to give it to him. He gets mad and starts calling her work phone from his office, telling her on voicemail to repay him. She doesn't, and then he starts making threats that he's going to fire her and that he's going to sue her and that he's going to physically harm her. She justifiably freaks out and goes to the police thinking that HR is going to take his side. The cops come to the office to talk to her. Then they want to talk to him, so they go to HR, who calls him into their office. He starts getting angry while talking to the police and winds up getting a free ride in the back of a cop car. To say his world imploded would be an understatement. He gets fired from his high-paying job, his wife finds out about the affair and files for divorce, taking the kids and moving back to the East Coast where she has a family, and finally, he has criminal charges to deal with over the scuffle with the police. Story 63. I'm not HR, but I got this story from the HR in my previous job. So there was a young woman on her first day of work. She was hired a couple of years before me. When she went out for the 1-hour lunch break, she didn't come back in time, and everyone was puzzled until another colleague who just came to the office told everyone, "Hey, you know what? There's a crazy naked girl with metal chain around her neck, and she's crawling in our parking lot with a man standing behind her. That's our new hire with her master." 30 minutes later, she came back to the office and explained her late as her master didn't allow her to come back to work until she accepted all the punishment she deserved. And that was also her last day in our company and got fired on the spot. Woof. No pun intended. Story 64. Kinda related, but I once worked for Vail, and they had a no-weed policy because the mountain was federal land. They knew all their employees smoked and really didn't want to catch us. They also provided employee housing, which they inspected once per year on a predetermined date. They reminded us of this date regularly and also made sure we knew they were not allowed to open any cupboards or closets. One of my friend's apartments got busted with 5 bowls, a wax machine, and a massive bong on the table. The managers gathered the 6 of them together and basically said, "We know one of you has been breaking the rules and will need to fire that one person. You have till tomorrow to let us know which one of you it was." One girl was injured, so she took the fall and everyone else chipped in some money for her to relocate and get surgery. It was ridiculous how hard the company worked to avoid firing all their employees. Story 65. I had a sales manager drive into a bus stop at 9 a.m. drunk as a skunk. When the cops arrived and took him away, he spent the entire drive to the station telling them who he was and who he worked for and how much money he made and how stupid they must be to be cops instead of sales managers for a mid-tier telecom company. The real kicker, beyond being drunk at 8 a.m. and yelling at the cops, was that in the car with him was a lady sales rep that worked for him, and it turns out he'd been having a long-time affair with her. She was also drunk as a skunk, and instead of doing a coffee run like they were supposed to be doing, they went to his house to drink and fool around and couldn't drive back safely. When I went to his office to terminate him, he tried blaming it all on her. We terminated both of them, and I actually thought he was going to punch me when I walked him to the lobby. I found little bottles of booze in his desk when I cleared things out to send to him. Story 66. I once witnessed a guy getting written up for a minor infraction only to completely lose his crap and start screaming about all the effing N-words. He didn't say N-words. That get away with the crap all the time and they were going after him because he is white. That write-up turned into having police called and him being removed from the property and given a trespass notice. The guy always kept to himself and was always quiet the entire shift. Nobody expected him to be such a vocal racist. Story 67. A member of our HR team someone we had just hired earlier in the month, was face down at her desk around lunchtime. I assumed she was just napping at her desk, but then I noticed there was a Tupperware of food upside down in her lap. I tapped her shoulder to try to let her know she spilled her lunch while sleeping. She wouldn't wake up. I started to nudge her and shake her a bit more in a slight panic. Then she opened her eyes, looked at me, couldn't speak, and I realized she was completely gone. Nodding off, she had shot up in the bathroom before lunch. At this point, I didn't want to make a scene. This was 2019 when offices were still full. I calmly motioned for our VP HR to come over, but as she came over, the employee who was nodding off stood up and left the office, stumbling the whole way out. Needless to say, she didn't work for us anymore after that. I felt bad because she clearly had a problem she had hidden initially. That was a shocking thing for me to witness. We were a pretty upbeat startup tech company with a fun professional culture. Never expected someone to do that right in the middle of the office. Story 68. Government think tank laboratory. A male mid-level engineer stole the keys from his female co-worker's purse, let himself into her home during work hours when he knew she would not be home, did unspeakable things to her underwear drawer. She had cameras and he was caught. The reason she had cameras is because he did it more than once. Not only was he fired, he went to jail. It came to light that he had done this to 4 or 5 different women over the years, but somehow he pled it down and isn't a registered offender, even though he absolutely is one. He did his time and now he works at another engineering firm. He looks like a regular nerdy guy with a wife and kids. You do not know your coworkers, people.